In 1895, the British Empire ruled the world. Its navy controlled the oceans, its banks controlled global finance, its colonies stretched across every continent. And then something unbelievable happened. A rising power still seen by Europeans as a former colony with no empire sent Britain a message that amounted to this: back away, or we go to war. The reason wasn't London, it wasn't Canada, it wasn't even Britain's own colonies, it was Venezuela. A poor, politically unstable country in South America somehow became the trigger for the most powerful empire on Earth to retreat from the entire Western Hemisphere. How did the United States, barely 3 decades removed from Civil War, force the British Empire out of the Americas? Why did Britain back down without firing a single shot? And why does this forgotten crisis explain how global power really shifts quietly, financially, and suddenly? To understand this moment, we have to rewind back to an old doctrine, a dying empire, and a world where money and credibility mattered more than armies. In 1823, the United States was weak. It had no global navy, no overseas army, no power to enforce threats. Yet President James Monroe issued a bold statement to Europe: the Western Hemisphere is closed to European colonization. This became known as the Monroe Doctrine. At the time, it was mostly symbolic. The US couldn't enforce it. Ironically, it was Britain through its powerful navy that unofficially upheld the doctrine. Why? Because British merchants wanted open markets in Latin America, not Spanish monopolies. So for decades, the Monroe Doctrine survived not because America was strong, but because Britain found it convenient. But by the late 1800s, everything changed. Britain's problem, the British Empire, was over. Germany was rising in Europe, Russia threatened British interests in Asia. Industrial competition was growing, debt markets were tightening, and naval dominance was becoming expensive to maintain. Britain could no longer afford unnecessary conflicts. America's transformation, meanwhile. The United States had quietly transformed. The world's largest industrial economy, massive steel production, rapid railroad expansion, financial power shifting to New York, a growing modern navy, a political elite obsessed with hemispheric dominance. America no longer wanted Britain as an informal partner in the Americas. It wanted control, and Venezuela became the test case. The conflict began with a map. In South America, Venezuela and British Guiana had disputed their border for decades. The land in question was remote, jungles seemingly worthless. But beneath it, gold deposits, strategic river access, prestige for imperial control. Britain claimed the border based on colonial-era maps. Venezuela rejected them. For years, Britain ignored Venezuelan protests. Why? Because Venezuela was weak, because Britain was strong, because empires didn't negotiate with small republics. But Venezuela did something unexpected. It appealed to the United States. At first, Washington ignored it. Then political winds shifted. By the 1890s, American elites had a new belief: the Western Hemisphere must be uncontested. President Grover Cleveland wasn't known as an imperialist, but his Secretary of State, Richard Olney, was. In 1895, Olney sent Britain a diplomatic note that shocked London. Its message was blunt: the Monroe Doctrine was now international law. The US had the right to intervene in hemispheric disputes. Britain must submit the Venezuela border issue to arbitration. And then came the line that stunned the British Foreign Office: the United States is practically sovereign on this continent. This wasn't diplomacy, it was a declaration of authority. Britain laughed it off. At first, President Cleveland escalated. He asked Congress for funding to unilaterally determine the border with or without Britain's consent. That was unprecedented. If Britain rejected the decision, Cleveland implied the US would enforce it. In other words, war. Now pause here. Why would Britain, ruler of a quarter of the world, back down from a fight with the US? The answer wasn't military weakness, it was financial vulnerability. Britain's empire was held together by more than ships and soldiers. It was held together by finance. London was the world's financial center. British banks financed global trade. British bonds funded empire infrastructure. Investor confidence kept the system alive. A war with the United States would mean massive borrowing, market panic, risk to the pound, capital flight, and potential German opportunism in Europe. Worse, America was becoming a creditor nation. British investors depended on US markets. A war would destabilize both, but Britain had more to lose. British strategists calculated the cost. Venezuela wasn't worth it. So Britain blinked. In 1897, Britain agreed to arbitration. It accepted the US brokered process. The final border ruling favored Britain in some areas, but that wasn't the real outcome. The real outcome was strategic. Britain had acknowledged US authority in the Americas, the Monroe Doctrine, as enforceable, a new balance of power. From that moment forward, Britain stopped challenging US dominance in the Western Hemisphere. Quietly, without ceremony, the empire didn't collapse, it repositioned. The Venezuela crisis marked a turning point. After 1895, Britain focused on Europe and Asia. The US expanded influence in Latin America. The Spanish-American War followed. The Panama Canal became possible. Dollar diplomacy emerged. Financial power shifted westward. America learned a critical lesson. You don't need to conquer territory to dominate it. You need financial leverage, strategic credibility, and the willingness to escalate. Once Britain tried subtle adjustments, diplomacy, naval modernization, imperial consolidation, but the structural problems remained. Rising competitors, slower growth, financial overstretch, dependence on global stability. The empire survived, but its dominance didn't. World War I would later expose these weaknesses completely. Here's the unsettling part. This pattern keeps repeating. A dominant power, overextended, financially exposed, dependent on credibility. A rising power controls production, gains creditor status, tests authority indirectly. Today, we see similar dynamics. Currency leverage replacing military force, trade routes becoming strategic weapons, regional disputes signaling global shifts, financial systems determining outcomes. Empires don't fall when they lose wars, they fall when they can't afford them. 1. Power shifts quietly. Britain didn't lose America with a battle but with a calculation. 2. Money beats muscle, financial exposure matters more than military strength. 3. Small crises reveal big changes. Venezuela wasn't the cause, it was the test. Every empire believes its dominance is permanent, until a smaller crisis forces a larger retreat. The question isn't whether power shifts again. The question is, who will blink next? If you want more hidden history about how empires rise, fall, and quietly surrender power, subscribe, because the most important turning points are rarely taught, they're forgotten, until they happen again.